If you're going to condemn me, Your Majesty, at least look at me first. The words left Elena Whitmore's mouth before she could swallow them back, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her as the wind whipped through Thornridge Square and carried the scent of smoke and cold iron across the gathered pack. She stood at the center of the clearing, wrists bound in front of her, her thin gray dress dusted with dirt from where they had forced her to kneel earlier, though she had risen on her own when the distant thunder of hooves rolled over the hills. 50 yards away, the black stallion came to a halt, steam rising from its flanks in the late afternoon chill, and atop it sat King Alexander Thornvale, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, his dark coat snapping behind him like a banner of judgment. The entire pack bowed as one, heads lowered, but Elena did not drop her gaze this time. She could feel every eye on her, could hear the whisper threading through the crowd. Traitor, poisoner, disgrace. And yet beneath the shame pressed into her skin for weeks, there was something calmer, something rooted. She had already made her choice. Marcus Hale, the local alpha, stepped forward with theatrical solemnity, recounting the charge in a loud voice meant to carry. Elena Whitmore had confessed to slipping silverroot extract into his son's tonic, a crime punishable by permanent exile. A murmur rippled outward, heavy with expectation. Alexander dismounted without haste, boots striking the packed earth with quiet authority, and for a moment he did not look at her at all. Instead, he surveyed the crowd, his silver eyes unreadable, taking in their rigid stances and carefully composed expressions. Elena's heartbeat thudded in her ears, not from fear of punishment. She had accepted that the night she signed her name to a confession she did not write, but from the weight of his presence. Stories said he could scent deception from 20 feet away, that no lie survived under his stare. Good, she thought. Let him see. You confessed, Alexander said at last, his voice low but carrying effortlessly across the square. Yes, Your Majesty, she answered, keeping her chin level. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the faint scar tracing his jawline, close enough that the air shifted with the crisp scent of pine and winter. Look at me, he ordered quietly. She did. For 3 long seconds, the world narrowed to that space between them. She expected anger, perhaps contempt. Instead, his gaze flicked to her wrists, lingering on the swelling beneath the rope, then to the faint bruise along her temple she had failed to conceal. Something changed in his expression, not softened, not yet, but sharpened. When did you administer the poison? He asked. 2 nights ago. With what hand? A strange question. My right. His eyes dropped to her fingers, stiff and slightly misaligned from where they had been bent back during questioning. He turned his head slightly, inhaling, and the faintest crease formed between his brows. Elena saw it then, the moment of doubt, the fracture in the story he had been given. Behind him, Marcus shifted, just enough to betray tension. Elena's pulse slowed. She had taken the blame to shield a frightened 16-year-old boy who had mixed the wrong herbs in a moment of panic, a boy whose mistake would have ruined more than one life. If silence was the price, she would pay it. But as Alexander's gaze returned to hers, colder now, assessing, she realized he was not looking at a criminal. He was looking at a question. And for the first time since they had dragged her into the square, hope flickered, small but stubborn, in the space beneath her ribs. The silence stretched across Thornridge Square until it felt like the entire valley was holding its breath, and King Alexander Thornvale did not step back from Elena Whitmore when he spoke again, his voice quieter now, but edged with something far more dangerous than anger. You say you used your right hand, he said evenly, yet your fingers are swollen and your knuckles misaligned. A ripple of unease moved through the crowd, subtle but undeniable. Elena kept her gaze steady even as her wrists throbbed against the rope. I administered the tonic myself, she replied, careful with each word. She would not contradict her confession. She would not expose the boy who had stood shaking in the infirmary, tears streaking down his face as he admitted he had mistaken silverroot for winter mint. She had seen the terror in his eyes, the fear of disappointing a father who valued strength above all else. She had stepped forward before anyone else could speak. That part, at least, had been easy. Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion of her, but in calculation. He turned his head just enough to address Marcus Hale without fully breaking his focus. Who questioned her? He asked. Marcus cleared his throat. My enforcers, Your Majesty. Standard procedure. And during this procedure, Alexander continued, did she resist? She was uncooperative at first, Marcus answered, a hint of defensiveness creeping in. Elena felt the shift in the air like the first crack of thunder before a storm. Alexander took one measured step away from her, turning now to face the pack entirely. He inhaled deeply, and those closest to him stiffened. There is silver root in this square, he said after a moment, but it is not strongest on her. A murmur rose, louder this time. Elena's heart stuttered. She had hoped he would see through it, but hope was dangerous. Marcus's jaw tightened. With respect, Your Majesty, she confessed. The matter is settled. A confession obtained under pressure is not truth, Alexander replied, his tone cooling by degrees. He walked past Elena then, slow and deliberate, closing the distance between himself and Marcus until only a few feet separated them. Bring me the tonic that was given to your son, he ordered. There was hesitation, brief but visible. One of the pack members hurried off toward the infirmary. Elena felt the weight of every stare intensify, suspicion beginning to fracture along new lines. She could sense it now, the shifting loyalties, the quiet realization that perhaps the story had been too convenient. Alexander glanced back at her once more. Why did you not defend yourself? He asked, not loudly, but the question carried. Elena swallowed. Because no one would believe an Omega over an Alpha's heir. Because a frightened boy should not lose his future over a mistake. Because sometimes silence protects more than truth. She did not say any of that. Instead, she answered simply, it would not have changed anything. His gaze lingered on her face, searching. That is not what I asked. For the first time since the ordeal began, her composure wavered. Not in fear, but in exhaustion. I accepted responsibility, she said softly, because someone had to. The words settled over the square like falling ash. Across from them, Marcus shifted again, and this time it was impossible to ignore the tension radiating from him. When the vial of tonic was finally brought forward, Alexander did not touch it immediately. He looked instead at the faces in the crowd, at the boy standing half-hidden behind two taller wolves, pale and trembling. And in that instant, Elena understood that the question was no longer whether she would be punished. The question was who truly deserved it. The glass vial caught the fading sunlight as King Alexander Thornvale finally took it into his hand, holding it up at eye level while the entire square watched in strained silence. And Elena Whitmore felt the tremor move through the crowd like wind through dry grass as he removed the stopper and inhaled slowly, deliberately, not rushing the moment, not allowing anyone to speak over it. His silver eyes sharpened, and then he turned, not toward her, but toward the cluster of wolves near the front where a teenage boy stood rigid, his shoulders tight, his gaze fixed on the ground as if he could disappear into it. Step forward, Alexander said, his voice calm but absolute. The boy hesitated, and it was Marcus Hale who placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder, guiding him forward with a smile that did not reach his eyes. This is unnecessary, Marcus said, his tone measured. My son has already suffered from this mistake. Alexander's gaze flicked to him briefly. Has he? He asked, and there was something in the question that made several wolves shift uneasily. The boy stopped 10 feet from the king, close enough that Elena could see the faint tremble in his hands. She had seen that same tremble 2 nights ago in the infirmary, when he realized what he had done, when he whispered that he only wanted to help, that he had read the label wrong in the dim light. What is your name? Alexander asked. Ethan, the boy replied, barely audible. Ethan Hale. Alexander nodded once. Ethan, have you handled Silverroot recently? The boy's breath hitched. Marcus stepped forward quickly. Your Majesty, he is still recovering. Surely you do not think a child capable of, I asked him. Alexander interrupted, not raising his voice, yet silencing the square completely. Ethan swallowed hard. Yes, sir, he said finally. I was organizing the shelves in the infirmary. I thought it was winter mint. A murmur broke out before being quickly hushed. Elena's chest tightened, not with fear, but with relief. It was out now. The truth, fragile but undeniable. Marcus's jaw clenched, and for the first time his composure cracked. He is inexperienced, Marcus insisted. But she confessed. Alexander turned slowly toward Elena, studying her with renewed intensity. You knew, he said, not as an accusation, but as recognition. She did not look at Ethan. She kept her eyes on the king. Yes. And you chose silence. Yes. A long pause followed, heavy with meaning. Alexander faced the pack again, his expression no longer merely assessing but resolute. This Omega accepted exile to protect a future Alpha from disgrace, he said, his voice carrying across the square with unmistakable authority. She bore accusation without protest. His gaze settled on Marcus. And you allowed it. The words did not need to be shouted to land with force. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it, the weight of public scrutiny turning against him. Elena felt the ropes loosen as one of the enforcers stepped back uncertainly, no longer sure of his place in the unfolding scene. For weeks, she had stood alone in whispers and sideways glances, her name spoken like a stain. Now those same voices were quiet. Alexander stepped toward her once more, stopping within arm's reach. Remove the bindings, he ordered. The rope fell away from her wrists, and blood rushed back into her fingers with a dull ache. She did not move. She did not step back. She simply stood there, steady and unbowed, as the balance of power in Thornridge Square shifted entirely. The rope fell completely to the ground, and for a brief moment no one moved, as if Thornridge Square itself had forgotten how to breathe. Elena Whitmore flexed her fingers slowly, feeling the dull ache travel up her arms, but she kept her posture straight, refusing to rub her wrists in front of them. She would not look smaller now. King Alexander Thornvale remained beside her, not touching her, not shielding her, simply standing close enough that the meaning was unmistakable. His presence altered the air. Marcus Hale, he said, turning at last toward the local Alpha. You permitted a false confession to stand in place of truth. The words were not loud, yet they carried further than any shout. Marcus forced a tight smile. Your Majesty, she chose to confess. We cannot control the decisions of every Omega who seeks attention. A sharp shift rippled through the crowd at that, and Elena felt it like static against her skin. Attention, as if she had stood bound in the center of the square for admiration. Alexander's gaze hardened by a fraction. An Alpha is responsible for the integrity of his pack, he replied, especially when that pack stands ready to exile one of its own without verifying the facts. Ethan's breathing was audible even from several feet away. The boy looked from his father to Elena, shame and fear battling across his face. Elena met his eyes only briefly and gave the smallest shake of her head, a silent reassurance. She had made her choice freely. She did not regret it. Alexander noticed the exchange. He noticed everything. The boy made an error. Alexander continued evenly. A mistake born from inexperience. That is correctable. What concerns me is not the mistake. It is the willingness of this pack to let an innocent bear it. A heavy silence settled, thicker than before. Several wolves lowered their gazes. The story had shifted completely now. Elena was no longer the center of accusation. She was the mirror held up to them. Marcus's composure slipped further. What would you have me do? He asked, and there was strain beneath the question. Publicly disgrace my heir. I would have you lead, Alexander answered without hesitation. Not conceal. The distinction landed clean and undeniable. A breeze swept across the square, lifting dust and carrying with it the faint scent of pine from the tree line. Elena realized her hands were no longer shaking. The fear that had lived under her ribs for weeks had thinned into something steadier. Alexander turned slightly toward her again. Elena Whitmore, he said, her full name deliberate and clear. You placed your pack above yourself. It was not praise exactly, but it was recognition. She swallowed, unsure how to stand beneath it. I did what I believed was right, she replied softly. He studied her face, and whatever he saw there seemed to settle something in him. When he faced the pack once more, his voice carried a finality that left no room for debate. There will be no exile, he declared. There will be no stain on her name. The words spread outward like a release of pressure. Shoulders lowered. Whispers shifted. Elena felt the weight lifting, not only from herself, but from the entire square. And as Alexander stepped half a pace closer to her, not possessive, not performative, simply aligned at her side, the unspoken message became clear to everyone present. She would not stand alone again. No one applauded when the decree was spoken, yet the relief that moved through Thornridge Square was almost physical, like the first warm current after a long winter. and Elena Whitmore felt it brush against her skin as though the valley itself had exhaled. King Alexander Thornvale did not step away from her when the murmurs began to rise again, softer now, uncertain, the pack recalibrating its understanding of the moment. For weeks they had looked at her as if she carried contamination. Now they looked at her as if they had missed something essential. Marcus Hale stood rigid, his authority visibly diminished not by force, but by exposure. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the matter is resolved. We are grateful for your guidance." The words were correct, but the tone carried strain. Alexander regarded him without expression. "Resolution requires correction," he replied. "Gratitude is secondary." His gaze swept across the gathered wolves, not with hostility, but with expectation. Leadership is not measured by how quickly you assign blame. It is measured by how you protect those who cannot protect themselves. The statement was simple, yet it landed with unmistakable weight. Several pack members lowered their heads. Elena felt the shift most clearly in the way no one stepped away from her now. No one recoiled. Ethan Hale took one hesitant step forward, his voice shaking. "I am sorry," he said, addressing her directly. "I should have spoken up." Elena studied him for a long second, remembering the fear in his eyes that night in the infirmary, the way his hands had trembled over the mislabeled jar. He was only 16, still learning, still becoming. "Learn from it," she said gently. "That is enough." Alexander watched the exchange closely. There was something reflective in his expression, as if he were weighing more than just the events of the day. The late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the packed earth, stretching the figures in the square into elongated silhouettes. Authority looked different in that light. So did courage. "This pack will issue a formal retraction," Alexander said at last, his voice steady. "Elena Whitmore's name will be cleared in writing and spoken acknowledgement before the next full moon." A murmur of agreement followed, this time more unified. Marcus nodded stiffly. "It will be done." Elena felt the enormity of that promise settle inside her. Not exile, not disgrace, restoration. She had prepared herself for departure, for a small bag packed in the quiet of night, for walking beyond the tree line alone. Instead, she stood in the center of the square, unbound and unbroken. Alexander shifted slightly, and though he did not touch her, his proximity felt deliberate, protective without spectacle. "You believed no one would listen," he said quietly enough that only she could hear. It was not accusation. It was understanding. She met his gaze, the silver of his eyes catching the fading light. "I did not expect anyone to," she answered honestly. A faint pause followed, charged not with tension, but with recognition. "Then expect differently," he replied. The words were not grand, not theatrical, yet they anchored themselves somewhere deep within her. Around them, the pack slowly began to disperse, conversations quieter than before, thoughtful rather than judgmental. The square no longer felt like a courtroom. It felt like a turning point. And as the last of the sunlight slipped behind the hills, Elena understood that what had shifted was not only her fate, but the way this pack would measure strength from this day forward. Twilight settled over Thornridge Square in layers of deep blue and fading gold. And though most of the pack had begun drifting back toward their homes, no one truly left the moment behind. It lingered in the air, in the way conversations were quieter, in the way eyes no longer slid past Elena Whitmore, as if she were invisible. King Alexander Thornvale remained where he was for several seconds after the crowd thinned, his posture relaxed but alert, as though the square itself still required his presence. Marcus Hale approached again, slower this time, the sharp edge gone from his expression. "The written retraction will be drafted tonight," he said, his voice measured. "It will be signed by me and witnessed by the council." Alexander inclined his head slightly. "See that it is," he replied. There was no triumph in his tone, only expectation. Marcus hesitated before adding, "The pack has been under strain. We reacted quickly." "Quick reactions are not the same as wise ones," Alexander answered calmly. Marcus absorbed that in silence before, stepping back, signaling the conversation's end. Elena stood a few feet away, uncertain whether to remain or excuse herself. For weeks, she had prepared for departure. Now she did not know where she belonged in this new version of the square. Alexander turned toward her at last. "Can you walk?" he asked, his gaze briefly dropping to her wrists. She nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty." The title felt heavier than before, layered with something more personal than authority. He studied her for a moment, as if weighing whether to say more in front of lingering ears, then gestured subtly toward the edge of the clearing. They moved together across the packed earth, not touching, but aligned in quiet rhythm. The distance to the tree line was no more than 30 yards, yet it felt like stepping out of one world into another. Away from the square, the evening air was cooler, scented with pine and distant wood smoke. "You understand what could have happened," Alexander said once they were beyond immediate hearing. "It was not a reprimand. It was fact." "Yes," she answered. "And you accepted it anyway." She drew a slow breath. "The pack is larger than one mistake." He watched her closely, something unreadable moving behind his silver eyes. "And you?" he asked. "Are you smaller?" The question caught her off guard. For so long she had defined herself by usefulness, by quiet service, by how little space she occupied. She considered it honestly. "No," she said after a moment. "But someone had to choose." A faint shift crossed his expression, not quite a smile, not quite surprise. "Strength does not always look like volume," he said quietly. The statement felt less like a lesson and more like acknowledgement. She glanced back toward the square where lanterns were being lit one by one, small golden circles pushing back the growing dark. "They will remember this," she murmured. "They will," he agreed. "Because I will." The certainty in his voice was not possessive. It was protective in a way that did not demand repayment. Elena felt the last remnants of fear dissolve into something steadier, something almost unfamiliar. Not dependence, not obligation, recognition. When they turned back toward the square together, the balance had shifted once more, not with spectacle, but with quiet understanding. And in that understanding, a new chapter had already begun to take shape. Lantern light flickered across Thornridge Square as evening fully settled in, casting warm gold against the deepening indigo sky. And Elena Whitmore felt the weight of the day settle into her bones now that the immediate tension had passed. The adrenaline that had kept her upright began to ebb, leaving behind a quiet exhaustion she could not quite hide. King Alexander Thornvale noticed. He always seemed to notice. The remaining council members stood in a loose circle near the well, drafting language for the formal retraction Marcus had promised, their voices subdued and careful, no longer sharp with accusation but tempered by reflection. The shift in tone was unmistakable. Elena lingered near the tree line, unsure whether to return home or remain until the document was complete. For weeks, that home had felt smaller, colder. Now she did not know what waited for her inside it. Alexander approached without announcement, his steps measured but silent on the packed earth. "You should not stand alone tonight," he said quietly, not as a command, but as consideration. She looked at him, surprised by the gentleness beneath the authority. "I have done so before," she replied, though the words sounded thinner than she intended. He studied her face for a moment, the lantern light catching in his silver eyes. "That does not mean you should continue to," he answered. The simplicity of it unsettled her more than any reprimand could have. No one had ever suggested she deserved accompaniment. Across the square, Ethan stood with his father, their conversation low but intense. Marcus's posture was no longer rigid. It was reflective, even chastened. The pack was recalibrating in real time, re-examining loyalties, assumptions, the ease with which they had accepted a confession that required so little proof. "They will treat you differently now," Alexander observed, following her gaze. "Some with respect, some with discomfort." Elena nodded. "They will not know where to place me." "You are not an object to be placed," he said evenly. "You are a member of this pack. That does not change because they failed to see it sooner." The words settled into her more deeply than she expected. For years she had measured her value by quiet usefulness, by how little trouble she caused, by how invisible she could remain. Now invisibility felt less like safety and more like erasure. "Your Majesty," she began carefully, "why did you question it?" "My confession was clear." He did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced back toward the square, toward the fading traces of tension. "Because truth has a scent," he said at last. "And fear has one too. Yours was not guilt." The statement was not mystical or dramatic. It was observational, grounded in instinct honed over years of leadership. She absorbed that quietly. He had not come expecting to defend her. He had come prepared to judge. And he had chosen to look closer. The council's voices rose slightly as the final wording of the retraction was agreed upon. A runner was sent to retrieve parchment and ink. The formal clearing of her name would be read before the pack at sunrise. Sunrise. The word felt symbolic in a way she had not anticipated. Alexander turned slightly toward her again. Tomorrow will be different, he said. It was not a promise of ease, but of change. Elena drew in the cool night air, steadying herself. I will be ready, she replied. And for the first time since this began, she believed it. The night deepened around Thornridge Square, and by the time the council sealed the parchment with Marcus Hale's crest, the stars were fully visible above the dark outline of the pines, sharp and steady against the sky. And Elena Whitmore stood a few steps back as the document was read quietly among the leaders one final time before sunrise would make it official. The words were simple but decisive. Her confession was withdrawn, the accusation nullified, her standing within the pack restored without condition. Hearing it spoken aloud, even in rehearsal, felt unreal. For weeks her name had been attached to whispers. Now it was being reclaimed in ink. King Alexander Thornvale remained nearby, not hovering, not commanding attention, but present in a way that anchored the moment. When Marcus finished reading, he lowered the parchment and looked toward Elena directly for the first time without accusation. At dawn, he said, his voice measured. This will be spoken before every member of Thornridge. Elena inclined her head, accepting the words without embellishment. Apologies were not easily given in front of a crowd. This was the closest she would receive, and she understood the weight of it. The council dispersed shortly after, lanterns dimming one by one as the square emptied into quiet pathways leading toward scattered homes. The night air carried the cool edge of early autumn, crisp and clean, and Elena realized she was shivering, though not from fear. The day had stretched longer than any she could remember. You have not eaten, Alexander observed, his tone matter of fact rather than critical. She blinked, surprised. I had not noticed. He studied her for a moment, then gestured toward the infirmary at the far end of the square. There is broth kept warm for council nights. You will not refuse it. There was no force in his words, yet she found herself nodding without hesitation. Inside the small building, the air was warmer, scented faintly with herbs and clean linen. She moved automatically toward the shelves she had organized 100 times before, but paused when she felt his presence at the doorway. He did not enter fully. He gave her space. That, more than anything, unsettled her in a quiet way. Respect instead of assumption. She poured a small bowl and sat at the narrow wooden table, the steam rising between her hands. Alexander leaned lightly against the frame, arms crossed, not imposing, simply watching. Tomorrow, he said after a moment, some will approach you out of guilt, others out of curiosity. She lifted the spoon slowly. And you? She asked before she could stop herself. A faint shift touched his expression. I approached because something did not align, he answered. And because leadership requires more than distance. The honesty of it settled between them without tension. She took a careful sip, warmth spreading through her chest. Outside, the square had grown still, the earlier murmurs replaced by the steady rhythm of night insects and distant wind. For the first time in weeks, her thoughts were not consumed by defense or preparation for exile. They were open. When she finished the broth, she stood, steady now, and met his gaze directly. Thank you, she said, the words simple but sincere. He inclined his head once, accepting the gratitude without claiming ownership of her outcome. Rest, he replied. Dawn comes quickly. And as she stepped back into the cool night air, the path to her small house no longer felt like a retreat. It felt like a return. The first light of dawn spilled over the ridge in a pale wash of silver and gold, stretching long beams across Thornridge Square as the pack gathered once more, quieter then. The day before, more deliberate, and Elena Whitmore stood near the front this time not because she had been summoned for judgment, but because her name was about to be spoken with clarity instead of suspicion. The air was cool, barely above 50 degrees, and each breath carried the scent of pine and distant frost, sharp and clean as if the valley itself had been reset overnight. Marcus Hale stepped forward with the sealed parchment in his hand, his expression steady but stripped of the easy confidence he once carried, and when he began to read his voice carried clearly across the square without theatrics. He spoke of error. He spoke of haste. He spoke of responsibility. And then he spoke her name without stain, without accusation, restoring her standing within Thornridge Pack fully and publicly. The words did not echo like the previous charge had. They settled, absorbed by attentive silence rather than restless murmurs. When Marcus finished, he did not immediately retreat. He lowered the parchment and faced her directly. "Elena Whitmore," he said, measured and clear, "this pack misjudged you." It was not an elaborate apology, but it was spoken before every witness that mattered. She inclined her head once, accepting the correction without spectacle. Around them, members of the pack began to nod, some stepping forward with quiet acknowledgments, others simply holding her gaze in a way they never had before. Respect felt different from pity. It did not shrink her. It steadied her. King Alexander Thornvale stood a few feet behind Marcus, observing not as an outsider, but as a leader ensuring the foundation was properly reset. When the formal reading concluded, he stepped forward, not to dominate the moment, but to seal it. "A pack is strongest when it protects its own with truth," he said evenly. "Let this be remembered." His gaze swept across the gathered wolves, pausing briefly on Ethan, who stood straighter than he had the day before, then settling finally on Elena. There was no need for further declaration. The message had already been delivered. As the pack began to disperse, conversations resumed with a different tone, lighter, reflective. Elena felt the weight that had pressed against her for weeks dissolve entirely. The square no longer felt like a place of accusation. It felt like ground she belonged to. She turned slightly and found Alexander beside her, close but not imposing. "You stood alone yesterday," he said quietly. "You do not stand alone now." It was not possession. It was acknowledgement. She met his silver eyes in the growing daylight and felt no need to lower her gaze. "I understand," she replied. For a long moment, they simply stood there as the sun rose fully over the ridge, washing the valley in warmth. What had begun as judgment had become correction. What had threatened exile had become restoration. And as Elena stepped forward into the morning light, shoulders straight and unbound, she understood that strength had never been about how loudly one roared in the square. It had been about who one chose to protect when silence would have been easier. Behind her, the pack moved with renewed awareness. Beside her, the Alpha King remained steady. Ahead of her, the path no longer led away from home. It led deeper into it,